learn some detailed legal regulations today. Yeah, fun stuff. Well, thank you all for coming. As you mentioned, Logan Campbell, founder and CEO of Aerotas. I've been in the drone industry for about as long as the drone industry has been around, which is about almost 5 years now. The point of this class today and what we're going to be going through for the entire day is basically a review of the FAA knowledge test, also sometimes known as the Part 107 test, Unmanned Aircraft General, and a handful of other names. Just to be clear that we're all in the right room, the purpose of this is not to have a philosophical discussion about the law and whether it's a good law and how to apply the law and blah, blah, blah. This is all about what's going to be on the test and trying to do my best to prepare you guys for what is going to be on the FAA knowledge test. So, yeah, like I said, goal, once you pass the test, the final goal, is there a question?
Sorry to interrupt, there was some questions I heard amongst some folks before class. Is this going to be the same lesson each of the 4 segments, or is it progressive and all day is the lesson?
It is progressive. So jumping real quick here, these are some of the sections of all the stuff that's going to be covered. Basically, the first 2 hours here, we're going to be covering the small UAS rule, which is the actual letter of the law, understanding the national airspace. The second 2 sessions are going to be modules 3, 4, and 5. And then the last one I'm going to be talking about just test day logistics, as well as in kind of that last section, I'm going to talk a lot more about actually application of the law to what it means in the real world, what it means when you're actually out flying, which isn't always exactly the same as the letter of the law. Quite frankly, there's a ton of content to cover. I wish I were a good enough instructor that an hour and a half would make you perfect for the test. But honestly, even with 5 hours, there will be there's just a lot of stuff to cover here.
We'll be taking notes. Will this PowerPoint be available by chance afterwards?
Yes. So all of the slides are going to be available. I'm going to reference a handful of resources that I will make available afterwards as well. And in fact, I'm even recording this right now so that everyone will wind up putting it on the internet on our website. So that if you guys want to watch a video and get a refresher before actually taking the test, you can do that as well too.
Thank you.
And thank you for kicking things off with questions. I actually like questions as well throughout the whole thing, so please at any point raise your hand or scream at me if I don't see you, and ask some questions, because that's probably the best way to learn a lot of these nuances too. Because some of this stuff is, quite frankly, it's legalese. There's a lot of stuff that is going to be kind of confusing. Some of the FAA questions are really, really miserably, painfully detailed, and they try and trick you on that sort of thing. But yeah, the goal is to help you get a remote pilot certificate. That's the last step in the process. Taking the FAA knowledge test is the first step. So just kind of that basic process. You register for the test, you go, you pass the test. That's the hard part. That's really the only hard part. But then there's a whole bunch of paperwork, and you have to file it with the FAA. And eventually you'll get a remote pilot certificate. And I'll just kind of show you what that looks like. It's a little physical license that looks just about like a manned pilot's license. Because from a legal perspective, that's what it is. In fact, a brief bit of history, the reason that the FAA has to do this is because they decided very early on with drones that if you are a drone pilot, you are a pilot. If you are a drone is an aircraft, and the person operating that is a pilot. And because of that, they are subject to all of the rules and regulations that Congress puts out, meaning that they have to be licensed as a pilot. And this test exists because the FAA, legally their hands were tied by Congress that they have to license pilots because drones are aircraft, and that's why we're doing it. So we're getting you through all of this information that pilots have to know. So, what does the knowledge test actually cover? It doesn't cover a lot of things, actually. It doesn't cover, for example, how to not crash your drone into a tree. Strangely, the FAA doesn't care if you do that. What they care about is if you interfere with manned aircraft and potentially if you hurt people on the ground. So it's about testing your knowledge of the national airspace. The national airspace is obviously everything where airplanes fly. Commercial aircraft, general aviation aircraft, military aircraft, police helicopters, medical helicopters, all of that. They all share what we refer to broadly as the national airspace. So these are kind of the rules of the road for the sky. It's also information pertaining to safely operating in the national airspace. Things like radio coverage, how pilots talk to each other, and how pilots communicate with one another. This test is applicable to all types of small unmanned aircraft systems, and we'll go into the details of what that means, but that's basically everything under 55 pounds, whether it has 4 propellers, 50 propellers, 1 propeller, or a jet turbine engine, as long as it's under 55 pounds and doesn't have a person in it, it's a small unmanned aircraft system. Another just kind of note up there, SUAS, UAS, UAV, drone are all effectively used interchangeably. Some people will nitpick about the nuances between them. I'm not one of those people. I use them pretty freely and pretty interchangeably throughout the course of that. It includes a ton of material not relevant to drone mapping. In fact, consider this my first of many apologies of the day. This test sucks. You're going to have to learn a lot of stuff that you only have to learn for the test, and then you can forget it the day afterwards. So a lot of stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with surveying, and honestly you'll never need to use in the real world, but you do need to know on the test. We are covering everything that I'm covering today will be on the test, and that's why we're going over it, even if it's not super useful knowledge. A lot of it is super useful. So yeah, everything here may be tested. And the other thing, there may be some questions not covered here. The FAA likes to throw curveballs at you on the test. The full body of knowledge from which they can pull questions is about something like 800 pages of books and information. And I don't want to just go through and read you 800 pages of information. So what we're covering here is about 98% of the material that could potentially be on the test, and will make up the vast majority of the questions. But it's worth noting that, honestly, even if you listen to every single word I say, there's a good chance there will be one question somewhere on the test that catches you off guard. Thankfully, you only need a 70% score to pass. It's all multiple choice, 3 answers per question, 3 possible answers per question, so your odds are pretty good there. And if you do fail it, you can retry it after 14 days. So, any questions about the basic structure? Yeah.
This will go through, so I'm currently certified.
Yep.
But my recurrent is coming up in this month. So this will help. I don't realize that they don't cover a lot. I mean, the recurrent test is only 40 questions.
Yeah.
Compared to 60, but this will go through a lot of that, right?
Yep. Recurrent test is a subset of the initial test. So if you do have your initial, this will help you take your recurrent pretty well. There are a few things that you don't need to do, like when we start talking about weather information. Weather is a really kind of tricky one. That one's not on the recurrent test, but it is still on the initial test. So if you're taking it, for those that aren't fully familiar, you have to renew your test every 2 years, or your license every 2 years. So you take it the first time, 60 questions, it'll cover everything. Then there is a recurrent test, which is a slightly different test with a little bit less material. So it's also worth noting when you call and schedule, you do need to tell them that it's a recurrent Part 107 test and not an initial, because they'll set you up for a different test.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So, as I mentioned, here are some of the sections, the kind of broadly speaking sections that we're going to be going over. The small UAS rule, that's actually the letter of the law. So here's what Part 107 says. Full, what it's technically called is 14 CFR Part 107, because the government loves all kinds of ridiculous acronyms. So it's Chapter 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, which is also known as the FARs, or Federal Aviation Regulations. And Part 107 is the subset devoted to small unmanned aircraft or drones. So colloquially known as Part 107, almost everyone in the drone industry just says Part 107. This is the Part 107 test. Number 2 is understanding the national airspace. That's going to be actually how airplanes operate. Sources of aviation information, those will be the actual books, the charts that we're going to teach you about today. Small UAS operational knowledge, that's things like, hey, how do you attach different weights to your aircraft and make sure that it has the right balance to stay safe? How does weather and altitude impact the flight characteristics of a fixed-wing aircraft, stuff like that. Human factors of flight is a very advanced module on basically how to not be drunk and an idiot while flying. And then testing information is all the logistics. And then, like I said, not mentioned on here is I'll be talking about in the last section of the day, actually applying this law. What laws do you actually need to worry about? What ones do people kind of break? What does it look like when When we say no flights over people, that's really easy to say and answer on a test question. What does that mean in the real world? So I'll be covering that at the end of the day today. Brief couple of things about who we are as Aerotas, as I was introduced. We founded this company in 2014 to help surveyors use drones. And we have clients all over the country. We actually help them turn drone data into line work, but I won't turn this thing into a sales pitch at all. End goal of surveying, obviously, deliverables, time, money, blah, blah, blah. If you want to know more about what we actually do for business, I've got a booth too, so come talk. But with that, let's actually dive right in to some of the information. So, Module 1, Small UAS Rule. This is the actual legal side, like I said, the text of Part 107. As with all things, this is kind of annoyingly complicated because there's a summary page that we can go through that's about 2 pages long and pretty easy. And the full text, including a lot of the comments and notes that the FAA puts on it, is about, I want to say it was like 900 pages or something, and we're not going through that. So what we talk about, what are the main categories of the restrictions within Part 107? So we have your aircraft restrictions. That's everything from how much it can weigh, how big it can be. If it's 500 pounds, it's not a small UAS. Operational limitations, how fast it can go, how high you can fly. Weather limitations, where is it legal to fly in terms of weather? Weather is not just a safety thing, but also things like visibility, making sure that you can see and avoid other aircraft. Location limitations, airspace restrictions, things like that. What it means to be pilot certified, how it applies to model aircraft users, which are totally different if you're flying for recreation or commercial use. And then waivers, how do you actually break these rules legally? So we'll go through all of that. So, let's start with the high-end stuff. And again, everything I'm saying here, this is all fair game to be on the test. Like, it is totally possible for there to be questions like, hey, what is the maximum weight for an aircraft under Part 107? 40, 55, or 60 pounds? The answer, 55 pounds. So, the aircraft itself must be under 55 pounds to qualify for Part 107. That's obviously huge. That's going to be a heck of a lot more than the vast majority of people are flying. I reference things like a Phantom 4, which is a common drone that surveyors use, weighs, they want to say 3.5 pounds, fully loaded with battery. It also, that 55 pounds includes absolutely everything on the drone. That means the drone, the propellers, it includes batteries, it includes fuel if it is an aircraft that has fuel, it includes payload, which would be cameras. It includes, if you're putting literally anything on there, when it is on the ground being weighed, that's what counts towards the weight limit here. Yeah, and more things just to give you a little context on this. The vast majority, 99% of drones that people fly are either electric multi-rotors or electric fixed wing. But there is a very small subset of either hobbyists or really specialty users that do have gas-powered or nitro-powered aircraft that also fall under this rule. And it's just as fair game for them to test on a gas-powered aircraft as on a battery-powered aircraft, so you gotta be aware that those are gonna be on there too. The drone must be registered with the FAA. That's a pretty cheap and easy process. It's like a $5 process to go on, register your drone, but it must be licensed and registered with the FAA. Furthermore, that license that registration number must actually be printed and affixed to the aircraft itself. A minor change to the rule that they just made in the last couple of weeks is now that license number must be labeled and affixed on the outside of the aircraft. It used to be in like a battery compartment would be okay, but it must be printed out, it must be visible, and it must be located on the aircraft itself. It's like a 10-digit alphanumeric kind of license plate number. It just needs to be visible and legible. There are no restrictions as far as, it doesn't need to be like a fancy metal plate or something. We just use label makers for all the stuff that we register. The aircraft itself does not need to be physically inspected or approved by the FAA. That's called an airworthiness certificate, and that's something that, for example, United Airlines Boeing 737, that is going to need to be inspected by the FAA, follow a very stringent set of protocols. Drones do not. However, you do need to perform a pre-flight inspection before every flight, legally required. For every single flight, you must physically inspect your aircraft and all the critical components. Further, external payloads are allowed if they are securely attached and they don't hurt the flight characteristics. So what does that actually mean, external payloads? That means, everything from swappable cameras, if you have those, to people want to know, hey, can I deliver, Amazon made a big splash with all of their drone delivery stuff. Those count as payloads as well. We'll get a little bit into the nuances of drone delivery here, but the short answer is drone delivery is covered in the test, and it is pretty much illegal under most circumstances because you're not allowed to deliver anything for hire. As in, you can't get paid to deliver anything, which makes it a little tricky. But these are the aircraft restrictions themselves on the drone. Questions about what you can and can't do with your hardware? All right. Operational limitations. So, the maximum ground speed of your drone is 100 miles an hour. Again, for all but the most specialized thing, that's totally impractical, and none of your DJI stuff is ever going to fly at 100 miles an hour. But maximum ground speed of 100 miles an hour or 87 knots. The test questions, that's another one of the little tricks that they'll put in sometimes, is they'll have a question and one of the answers will be 100 miles an hour and the other answer will be 100 knots. And you have to be able to know that it's 100 miles an hour or 87 knots. Or maybe the answer will be 87 miles an hour or 87 knots and you need to know the answer. It's awful that they do that, but that's kind of what they asked. Yeah.
You use the term DJI stuff. What is that?
Oh, that's just, I apologize. That's a popular manufacturer of drone hardware. They make some of the most popular is the white electric quadcopters. So that's just a brand that they make a lot of the most popular drones that are used in surveying. But yeah, so maximum ground speed of 100 miles an hour, 87 knots. Maximum altitude of 400 feet above ground level. So let's go into what that exactly means. 400 feet above ground, not necessarily above takeoff. Now that means if you take off and you go up 400 feet and there's a valley to your left and you fly over to the side and that valley drops by 50 feet, you are now 450 feet directly above the ground there, and you are strictly speaking in violation of the law. Now again, no one's going to come and, with a reflectorless total station and measure that and say, hey, you're above 400 feet. But that's what the law says, 400 feet above the ground. Or you must remain within 400 feet of a structure. So if we have this beautiful graphic here, if there is a tower, you can fly up to 400 feet above the tip of that tower, which is then more than 400 feet above ground, but so long as you remain within 400 feet of the top of a structure, then it is perfectly legal. Now that, to give you an example, that is a question that almost for sure will be on your test, because I've taken the test a couple of times just for the sake of it, and something like that has been on every single test. There's a tower on this chart, and the top of the tower is at 327 feet. What's the highest above ground that you can fly? 327 feet, 400 feet above the tower, 727 feet. That's going to be your answer. So that whole within 400 feet above ground is really important, but 400 feet above any structure is also going to be really important and is definitely going to be tested. Yeah?
When you say structure, if you were to take off from a hill but stay within 400 feet of it, even though you were over a valley, would that apply?
Yes. Yes, it would. So, yeah, building, cell tower, radio tower, any of that. Short answer is stay within 400 feet of stuff and you're in the clear. Little context with that, most manned aircraft are required to stay above 500 feet. There are a lot of different weird exceptions for police helicopters, emergency medical helicopters, whatever. But the vast majority of other manned aircraft are going to be above 500 feet most of the time. So that's why it creates a lot of this kind of buffer zone to try and keep them safe. Because again, that's really what the FAA cares about. And that's what this whole test is about. It's protecting the national airspace, which to them means protecting manned aircraft. That's what it's about. It's not about how to teach you to be a responsible, good pilot. It's about keeping the airspace safe for the FAA.
So just to confirm then, you can be, say, 800 feet high if there's a 400-foot building.
Bingo. Yep, and as long as you're above it. If you then move to the side and you're still 800 feet, then you're in violation.
So with that 400 horizontal rule, you can be 400 above takeoff if you're within 400 feet and there's a valley, but if you're above the building 400 feet, you can't stay within 400 feet and be 800 feet up.
As long as your short answer is, if you could draw a line between where the drone is and a structure, and that line is 400 feet or less, then you're good.
You'd be 800 at that point.
Yeah, exactly. So you can be next to the tower, and not directly above it, but as long as you're within 400 feet of that tower, it can be a 1,000-foot tower. You can go up to 1,000 feet and you're fine. As long as you stay within 400 feet of a structure, you are fine. If there is no structure, then your maximum takeoff altitude is 400 feet.
Okay.
And the key number to remember there, 400 feet. That's going to be pretty important.
So you're, just to make sure I understand, so if there's a building, then you can be 400 feet horizontally or 400 feet vertically
Yes.
from the building.
Yep, exactly. All right, next big operational limitation, see and avoid. See and avoid is, that is another just really, really, really important FAA rule for, this is how you are legally required to avoid other aircraft. You must see them and you must avoid them. Now what that means in a couple of things is that you must be able to see and avoid other traffic or dangers in the airspace. That means that you have to be able to see the airspace. You have to physically be there present. We'll go over a little bit about that later. You must keep the aircraft within visual line of sight. We'll go over that a little bit more later as well. And you must be constantly observing the airspace for other air traffic or hazards. That means you're looking around, you're listening, you're scanning the airspace back and forth. These are all legal requirements that you have to do. And the other part of see and avoid is not just see, but also avoid. If you see another aircraft, it is your responsibility as a drone pilot in command, remote pilot in command is one of the terms that they'll use most frequently. As the remote pilot in command, you're the low man on the totem pole. You must avoid other aircraft. It is not the responsibility of other aircraft to avoid you. If two drones were to be in the same aircraft, or in the same airspace, you're flying your drone, someone else is flying theirs, you see the other drone, it is the responsibility of both pilots to avoid each other. You both must actually take active maneuvers to land and clear the airspace before you go back and fly. That's what the law says. It is your responsibility to avoid everything. Doesn't matter what it is, you're a low man on the totem pole, you see something, you avoid it. Proper scanning techniques, I think we cover a little bit later as well, that you're supposed to actually kind of look back and forth and scan the airspace to make sure you get good coverage of it. So, visual line of sight. According to Part 107, the aircraft must always remain within the visual line of sight of the operator or a designated visual observer. That means that you need to see the aircraft unaided by anything other than corrective lenses. Binoculars do not count. Cameras do not count. Advanced sensor technology like radar and whatever it is does not count. Eyeballs with glasses and contacts are the only thing that will qualify for visual line of sight as far as the FAA and Part 107 is concerned. Onboard cameras, like I said, do not count at all. They may be used legally if you have your live camera from the drone. You can use it to supplement visual line of sight, but it cannot replace visual line of sight. Visual line of sight has to be with your eyeballs on the drone itself. Additionally, we talk about a designated visual observer. So what that is you can have more than one person as part of a drone operation. There's one guy who's going to be your remote pilot in command. They're effectively the captain of the mission. Every mission needs to have a remote pilot in command. And that remote pilot in command is the one responsible for the entire operation. They don't even have to be the ones that are operating the controls, but they're the ones that are responsible and they have to be physically present on the site. But there's also this option called a visual observer, which is someone who is designated to only watch the drone. Their whole job in that mission when they're a designated visual observer is to keep eyes on the drone and to communicate with the pilot in command if they see anything. Now, this does create some opportunity for extending beyond one person's line of sight, that if there's you as the pilot, and then maybe half a mile down the road you have a visual observer, and you are in constant communication with that visual observer, then you can actually fly it over him, and then if he gets visual line of sight, and it passes out of your line of sight, that is still legal, as long as it is within the visual observer's line of sight. There are a couple of nuances to that regulation as well, that you must be in constant communication, and that's not super well defined what that means, but in general, two-way radios are considered good enough. Texting with him, not good enough, but you must remain in direct communication with your visual observer, confirm that they have eyes on the aircraft. Once they have visual line of sight, it can pass out of your line of sight and you're still legally within the right. Operationally, in the real world, that's super challenging to do, but at least from a legal perspective, that is totally fine to make use of the visual observer.
Does the visual observer have to be certified?
No. The remote pilot in command is the only person that actually needs to be licensed and have a Part 107 license.
So you mentioned that the pilot might be able to have someone else operate the drone. In those circumstances, must the person operating the drone be licensed?
Great question. No, they don't have to be. Part of that's for training purposes as well, that I've done tons of trainings too, where I'm the pilot in command and people are new, they don't have their license yet. The responsibility is that the remote pilot in command, who is going to be that person that is in charge of the operation, they do need their Part 107, and they must be able to basically take control of the aircraft if and when necessary. That means if someone else is taking the controls, maybe I need to be able to grab it from them, or I need to be able to give them clear enough instructions that they can see and avoid any obstacles. If I, for example, as the remote pilot in command, if I saw an obstacle that they didn't, I need to be able to tell them what to do. So there are a couple of things you can either directly grab the controls, override them, or instruct them, but the person that's touching the controls doesn't really matter. What matters is who is that remote pilot in command. They're the ones that are in charge of the mission. It's remote pilot in command, they're in charge, they take all of the responsibility. And again, they must be physically present on site, and another thing is you can only be a remote pilot in command for one aircraft at a time. You can't have one remote pilot in command and 30 aircraft flying around you, that's what the law says. One person, one pilot, one drone. That's how it works. So yeah, visual line of sight, this is another one of those things that it's one of the more restrictive rules out there. And the FAA really cares about it. Because it combines with see and avoid, that the way that they prevent any collisions is that you must keep the drone in your sight so that you can see other air traffic and avoid it as necessary. In the real world, this means about a 1,500-foot radius is all you can fly. Technologically, it would not be too challenging for us in this room to build a drone, hit go, and have it fly 100 miles and even come back. But that is not within visual line of sight, so this is one of the more restrictive rules out there that they're actually pretty strict about as well. So here's some more, oh sorry, go ahead.
So you may have said this, but I missed it. Can you have a network of visual observers? I mean, theoretically, spreading out several miles?
Yeah, you actually can.
They are in communication with the...
Yep.
Yeah, I see. Okay.
And it does get pretty messy. There are some more operational limitations. I'm kind of venturing in the world of waivers here too. So yes, you can have multiple visual observers, but you always need to be able to have you or a visual observer see and avoid the aircraft.
Did you say that those visual observers also have to be licensed?
No, they do not.
They do not.
They do not. There's also I don't think this is on the test, but the FAA has put out some paperwork on it. For visual observers and for handing off authority of who is the remote pilot in command mid-mission. That I'm the remote pilot in command, it flies half a mile out of my line of sight, and then I actually transition my controls to someone else down the line, and you kind of daisy chain them. That is, strictly speaking, legal. Operationally, it is a nightmare. Horribly difficult to actually change up radio links, verify those sorts of communications, because you have to do it almost every half mile or something. So it's a mess, but strictly speaking, it's legal.
Do you have a limitation on how many observers you can have?
I don't actually think there are any limitation to the number of visual observers. Once we start getting into crew resource management, you actually would probably run afoul of some of the other regulations about crew resource management with that many people, you wind up having people yelling at each other. So even if you have, 60 visual observers, they'd say, well, you can't actually, or you can't properly organize, maintain, and communicate with those people. So just having 60 visual observers, that's not gonna, you might follow the visual observer side of the law, but you're gonna break some of the other responsible parts of the law that it's like, no, that doesn't pass muster. A lot of these different rules and regulations are gonna conflict too, that like, yeah, that's, if you don't have good crew resource management, you don't have good communication, that's illegal. So, visual observer, here's just some of the more text about that. Designated person that helps the pilot in command see and avoid the air traffic or objects aloft or on the ground. Their sole duty, if they are a visual observer, is to observe the aircraft and airspace. That's another reason why it makes it tricky to have multiple. You can't just have people kind of sitting by doing other stuff. Their sole duty, they have to be there standing, doing nothing else but watching the aircraft and the airspace to be a legally designated visual observer. If they are checking their phone for emails, they cannot be a legally designated visual observer. They need to have their eyes on the sky. It is tedious, it is boring, but it's what the law says. It does let you see further than one person's line of sight, and the letter of the law, you must remain in effective communication at all times. That's the type of thing that will be on the test. What counts as a visual observer? They must be in effective communication. You won't see a question on the test like, if I have a radio operating over XYZ frequency, does that count as effective communication? No, it doesn't matter. That type of question won't be on the test. What will be is yes, that you must be in effective communication. You must coordinate to scan the airspace for hazards and maintain awareness of the aircraft through direct visual observation. Again, eyeballs on, no binoculars, no additional tools, radar and stuff like that does not satisfy the rule. Only eyes unaided by anything other than corrective lenses. Yeah?
You can put external lights on the drone to make it visible further though, correct?
Yes, that is correct. The FAA has not put a fixed rule on what distance, in terms of linear distance, qualifies as visual line of sight. In practice with small aircraft, that are unlit, it's about 1,500 feet. If they are larger aircraft or fixed wings, or you add any sort of additional payload, like strobe lights or something, that can extend it. But the key thing is, and again, for the purposes of this, for the purposes of Part 107 in the test, you must be able to see it unaided by anything other than your eyeballs, pretty much. Whatever tools you use to do that, great, awesome, as long as they don't break other FAA rules too. So, a couple other restrictions that are also in the text of the law. One pilot, one aircraft, as I already mentioned, cannot operate multiple UAS at one time. So you can't have one pilot or one remote pilot in command, two guys that are flying, and then they're up doing their own thing, maybe flying different sides of the site. That would count. You would need two remote pilot in commands running two parallel missions for that sort of thing. No operations from a moving aircraft. Weird that they would have to put that in, but they do. So if you are on a moving aircraft, you cannot operate another moving aircraft. That restriction exists for people that are trying to do like really long distance testing, so they might have this big small UAV aircraft, like a 55-pounder, and then have a chase plane and a Cessna, and they'll operate it from their chase plane. Not allowed, no operations from a moving aircraft. No operations from a moving vehicle. However, that one comes with a couple of asterisks. Unless it is over a sparsely populated area. How do they define sparsely populated? They don't, so you don't have to worry about it. But that's what actually matters, is that you can operate from a moving vehicle if it is over a sparsely populated area. Again, I'm always tempted to tell you more with the real world stuff. That's another really hard thing to do in practice, operate from a moving vehicle. And what sparsely populated is not clearly defined, but the general rule of thumb from the FAA, it's got to be really sparsely populated to do that. But that's what's at least going to be on the test. And then lastly, this is one of those big kind of catch-alls for the FAA. You can't fly if you have any reason to know of any physical or mental condition that would interfere with the safe operation of the aircraft. It's a catch-all. That is anything. absolutely anything that they didn't already think of. If you as a pilot know or should have known that this could interfere with the safe operation, then that inherently makes it illegal. Yeah. All right, so here's a bit more on drone delivery too. Delivery is allowed, technically speaking, the FAA's words, not mine. Delivery is allowed if the system weighs less than 55 pounds total, including payload, that would be the package, as well as all of the other stuff, propellers, batteries, fuel, and whatnot. The flight remains within visual line of sight and is not from a moving vehicle or aircraft. That moving vehicle, operations from a moving vehicle exemption specifically does not apply for any sort of drone delivery. So kind of a weird nuance to the law, but again, it's the type of stuff that they put on the test. And it does not cross state lines. Why that is important, I don't know, but if you are doing delivery, these are the key restrictions.
How are these guys doing delivery if they have people out of sight?
They're basically not. I mean, this is basically a killer in the real world. Are you saying how are like these companies doing delivery? Most of them are pretty much only doing, at least within the United States, they're only doing test deliveries that are like a couple 100 feet apart or something, and in controlled airspace with no one in between. It's, from a practical purpose, the law as it is written here is basically just, it kills drone delivery almost entirely. But that said, the law as it stands, like I said, visual line of sight, 55 pounds, does not cross state lines, not from a moving vehicle.
Quick question, sorry to back up on
Sure.
visual observer, just to make sure, do you have to have a secondary person as a visual observer, or can you fly it alone?
Oh, you can fly it alone.
Okay.
Yeah, you do not need a visual observer. Visual observers are optional.
They're usually if you're trying to go farther than you can see.
Not just that, sometimes, especially if you're a novice pilot, they can be really helpful just so that you can focus more on the actual mission and that they're watching the skies more. So there's some operational benefits even to having one right next to you. For example, let's use drone surveying as an example. You set up your flight mission, it might help for you to actually be monitoring your tablet most of the time, not watching the airspace. From a legal perspective, you're allowed to sit there and look at your tablet, look at your camera, look at your screen, and have the visual observer scanning for the airspace. Same thing with maybe a cinematography drone. If you're the pilot, you might have a pilot, a camera operator, and a visual observer. It's all part of your crew. And all three of those people are going to have very specific functions. The pilot is sitting there looking at his own camera and controls and worrying about that. Camera operator worrying about all the camera settings on the drone. Visual observer monitoring traffic. All three of those people, that's what the FAA would recommend for that type, would require for that type of mission. So that you can have the crew each doing their own different function. That said, yes, one-man shows totally allowed. You are the pilot, you are flying, and then it is your responsibility to scan the airspace, let the autopilot and everything else deal with itself. You're holding your thumbs or whatnot, but it's your job to keep your eyes on the sky. So visual observers are optional, not required, but if you do want to, as the remote pilot in command, if you want to take your eyes off the sky, then you will need something like a visual observer. All right, weather restrictions. So, these are again mostly on see and avoid stuff and maintaining separation from aircraft. A minimum visibility of 3 statute miles, that is as opposed to nautical miles, but statute miles is what the law says in this case. Daylight operations only, or civil twilight if you have anti-collision lighting. Again, this is their text, and that's another one of those questions that's likely to be on the test. So what is civil twilight? It is 30 minutes before official sunrise to 30 minutes after official sunset if you have specifically defined anti-collision lighting on. You do not need to know the technical regulations of what qualifies as anti-collision lighting. You can look that up later if you really care about it. But you do need to know that it's daylight only, unless you have anti-collision lighting on, and then it is in civil twilight, which is plus or minus 30 minutes on either side. Questions there? I know that one can be a little nuanced.
Is there a ceiling height limitation?
Absolute?
Yes.
17,999 feet. We'll cover that later. So, clouds next. you must stay 500 feet below clouds. So if there is cloud cover at 400 feet, strictly speaking, you cannot fly legally. And also you must stay 2,000 feet horizontally from clouds. With drones, it is not allowed to fly over clouds. Not that it would really make sense because of the 400-foot limitation and whatnot, but the ones that are going to be on the test, 2,000 feet horizontally, 500 feet below clouds. That is from part of a see and avoid restriction that you must be able to see an aircraft coming. So that's, you got that 2,000 feet laterally. And of course, like I said, minimum visibility of 3 statute miles or higher. That means flying in dense fog is illegal because you just can't see far enough. Flying within clouds is illegal because you can't see and you're obviously not 2,000 feet away. All right, so here's some airspace limitations. And this we'll get a heck of a lot more into when we start reading some of the charts for how we read this. Airspace operations, or airspace is split, generally speaking, into A, B, C, D, E, and G airspace, or in aviation speak, is Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, and Golf airspace. Operations in class Golf airspace, which you can see are all the pink things there, I'll go into those in more detail in a second, are allowed without any air traffic control permission. So G is going to be, it looks like it's small on this chart, but it's the majority of airspace that we would be flying in. Operations in Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and Echo, those are going to be types of controlled airspace is what they're called. They are allowed only with required air traffic control permission, so that's going to be from the operational control tower of the FAA or a different type of authorization. And Class A, you were asking about your effective ceiling. Class A operations are not allowed for drone operations, but Class Alpha starts at 18,000 feet. So you can fly up to 17,999 feet, and Class Alpha is then off limits. Of course, how would you actually do that? There's nowhere in the continental United States where it would ever be possible.
No, we've had instances where the firmware limited the ceiling height, and like we went up to Alpha Pilot, the ski resort, and
so that's going to be a safety limitation. And so that's when we get into the impacts of weather and like air density and density altitude on UAVs, that's where it's going to make it potentially unsafe to operate in the thin air. If you had an aircraft that was specifically designed to operate in thin mountain air, totally legal. We've flown as high as 14,000 in some of our drones, actually. But you do need specialized aircraft that can fly in that really, really thin air, because they're working hard to fly up in that when you're up in 10,000 feet plus.
So the MSL, like 18,000, does that mean sea level? Is that what that stands for?
Yes, that's mean sea level. So let's talk about this a little bit, and I'll get into it a little bit more. So Class A, that's going to be your super high altitude cruising speed for commercial jetliners, basically. It's off limits to drones, and for all practical purposes, it is totally out of scope for this course, and for Part 107, but you just have to know that it exists. Class Bravo, these are going to be your nation's biggest airports. That's going to be LAX, Chicago O'Hare, Hartsfield Jackson, Newark Airport. These are going to be Class Bravo airspace. The way that it works, these are shaped kind of like an upside down wedding cake, so that you have a small cone on the bottom, on the ground level, and as you get higher, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, when we're talking at 400 feet, that means the place where drones are operating is like this level. So we never actually have to fly in the, as drone operators, we never have to fly in those higher tiers, but we have to know about them, and they will be on the test. So the way it basically works is for about 5 miles, a 5-mile radius, that it might be Class Bravo up to 10,000 or up to 1,000 feet, and then it's a 10-mile radius for that next bracket, and then a 15-mile radius for at higher altitudes. And that's for like airplanes that are effectively on a takeoff or landing pattern. They climb the further away they get from the airport. So that's Class Bravo. Those are the biggest airports. Class Charlie is going to be kind of medium-sized airports. It's again the upside-down wedding cake, but typically only going to have 2 tiers to it. Class Delta, also controlled airspace. These are going to be smaller municipal airports. Class E is kind of all of this airspace in between that usually is from either 700 feet and up or 1,200 feet and up, all the way to 17,999. And it may sound like I'm being nitpicky when I say 17,999 instead of 18,000, but the FAA is nitpicky, so that actually matters. Class A is 18,000 and up. Class Echo is from 700 up to 17,999. Another one of those just like kind of tips to be aware of. That 1 foot may make a difference on some of the questions. Like, what is the maximum flight altitude that is within Class E airspace? And one of the answers will be 17,999 and the other will be 18,000. And so you have to know that 17,999 is Echo and 18,000 is Class Alpha. And then, so Class G, the vast majority of airspace on the ground is actually going to be Class G. Class G up to 700 feet in most cases, 1,200 feet in some. There are a few places that are Class E, Class Echo airspace all the way to the ground, and we're going to go over this airspace stuff because I know that's a lot. We're going to go over that in a lot more depth in not too long.
So the symbols towards the bottom that looks kind of like a not equal, is that symbolizing a runway?
Yeah, this symbolizes airport runways. Just that like this is an airport, and so if this were an airport, this would be the shape kind of surrounding the vehicle.
And then does one learn the circumstances of these through looking at the chart to see how it is in an individual area?
Yep.
And then the distances on there, so in a sense it's kind of apples and oranges, since some of them are above sea level, others are above ground level.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And we'll teach you how to read those because every airport has the airspace tailored specifically to that airport. Some of them have weird corridors, some are weirdly shaped because of topographic features like mountains. Some of them are weirdly shaped because there are other airports nearby, so that they have to share the airspace, and half of it's going to be Bravo for one airspace, half of it's going to be Charlie for another. It's all going to be bespoke for every airport. This is just like a general, what most of them kind of look like. But again, we'll talk way more about airspace later on. Flying over people. You may not fly over other people unless those people are directly participating in the operation of the aircraft, or they are located under a covered structure or inside of a stationary vehicle. Again, if you want to actually talk about this, come to my last session today and we'll talk about what that means in the real world. For right now, I'd like to keep it focused on, because this is one of the ones where everyone has questions of what this means in the real world. For right now, let's keep it focused on what it actually means from a legal perspective. That means it means exactly what it says. No flying over people unless they are directly participating in the operation of the aircraft. Now, worrying about the definition of, okay, what does it mean to be directly participating? They won't ask that on the test. But you need to know that that is what makes it okay for you to fly over a person, is if they're directly participating in it. And what does it mean to be directly over someone? Is if they're right over there versus if they're 2 feet off to the side, does that count as directly over? You don't need to know that. You just need to know the letter of the law. You can't fly over them unless they're directly participating or located under a covered structure. Inside a building is fine. Inside a stationary car is fine. Operating drones over moving vehicles is explicitly not legal under Part 107. Other employees on a project are not considered to be directly participating in the operation, and yeah, like I said, people in moving vehicles are not considered to be covered, and from a test perspective, that would not be allowed.
So with this wording, is it illegal to fly over a construction site using a construction drone?
Depends on your interpretation. Come to my lab. I'll open that up later. That's not the type of question that they would ask. Because there honestly is a lot of legal debate, and even like lawyers will interpret the laws in different ways, and that hasn't been super, super clearly answered. All right, pilot in command. So as I've alluded to numerous times, every mission needs a pilot in command. PIC or RPIC are both abbreviations that the FAA frequently uses, RPIC being remote pilot in command. They do not have to be the person operating the controls, as I mentioned. They must have a certificate with a small UAS rating. That is, again, your FAA language for they've got their Part 107 license or their Part 107 certified. That's what people say colloquially. From the FAA legal perspective, it is a pilot in command with an airman's certificate with a small UAS rating. That's what it's called there. And the PIC is responsible for the entire mission, including both planning and operation. PIC can't show up and hit go on someone else's mission plan. That does not qualify unless they have reviewed the mission plan and they know what they're actually doing. They are responsible, basically, buck stops with the pilot in command. It's a big part of the FAA's just kind of responsibility is that they know that this is the person. If you're the one with the Part 107 license and you're the pilot in command, it's your ass on the line if something goes wrong. And the FAA does that very intentionally. They don't want anyone to shirk responsibility and say, my boss told me to do it, so it's his fault. Nope, if you're the one that was the pilot in command, it's your fault. It does not matter what your boss told you to do. It does not matter if there are external pressures. It is your responsibility as the pilot in command to be responsible for that mission. The FAA is very, very clear about that stuff. And it is your responsibility. And that's what we're training, that's what this part of this pilot licensing thing is too, is to make sure that you know it's your responsibility and you have the information and tools required to stand up to external pressures if you need to, and keep your operation safe. So what does it take? Qualification from a legal perspective, you must pass your initial aeronautical knowledge test, or I hate how many just these. I almost feel bad even talking to you guys because there are exemptions to so many of these different rules. Pass your initial aeronautical test or hold a valid Part 61 pilot certificate. That is going to be a manned aircraft full-blown pilot's license. If you have a full manned aircraft full-blown pilot's license, all you need to do is complete a small UAS online training course. Does anyone here actually have their pilot's license, an actual pilot's license or anything? Yeah, it makes sense. This would be total overkill, of course, if you did. But that's one of the exemptions. You must be vetted by the TSA. That's just paperwork. Once you pass the test, you file your paperwork. TSA does really kind of cursory background checks to make sure you're not on any terrorist watch lists. And you must be at least 16 years old. That is the limit for getting a remote pilot certificate.
Is that just on the initial testing, or is that something that you need to get every 2 years when you renew? With being vetted by the TSA?
Oh, no, you do not need to be re-vetted by the TSA. You just need to take the test.
Can that get you through a TSA screening?
Nope. Sorry. I've actually tried it before. It doesn't help at all. Also, even at a bar, they won't let you in if you show your pilot's license at a bar. Everyone's like, no, it's not a valid ID. So, pilot certification requirements. You must make available to the FAA upon request the UAS for inspection, testing, along with any associated documents. Registration documents, maintenance documents, your pilot and command stuff. This is available to the FAA on request. Quick divestiture or sidebar to the real world, they never, ever, ever do this unless there's some sort of very serious incident that they're investigating. But the law, back to the law. On request, you must be able to give all of this to the FAA for inspection. That is a legal requirement there. You also must report to the FAA within 10 days any operation that results in serious injury, loss of consciousness, or property damage of at least $500 excluding the aircraft. That's a big, big important caveat because people crash drones, quite honestly, a lot. And people crash very, very expensive drones a lot. And the FAA does not care if all you do is hurt your own property. And if all you do is destroy your own $100,000 drone, they don't care. But you do so much as $500 of damage to anything that anyone else owns on the ground, then you are required to report it. Same thing, any injury, you must report it to the FAA within 10 days. Other operational requirements, conduct a pre-flight inspection, we've mentioned that before. That's before every single flight. You must actually inspect the aircraft. As far as what that pre-flight inspection entails, it is whatever is necessary to make sure that the drone can be safely operated. It's going to be different aircraft to aircraft. If there are manufacturer guidelines, then you'll want to use the manufacturer guidelines for inspecting the aircraft. If there aren't, then maybe you develop your own inspection procedure. And also you must ensure the UAV is registered and marked. Again, registered with the FAA, and it has that thing marked on the outside. All right, model aircraft users. This rule, Part 107, applies only to commercial operations of UAVs, not to these guys with their model airplanes. They operate under a totally different set of rules. It's called Section 333. No, that's not a 333. They're 30. I forget the number for model air. 306. That's right. They're 306. So either way, Part 107 does not apply to recreational flying. If you and your kids are flying a drone in your backyard, you don't need a Part 107 license. They don't need a Part 107 license at all. It can only be for recreational purposes. It can't be for any commercial purposes. This is one that the FAA, people have tried to create these little loopholes like, oh, but what if I'm doing a survey job and I'm just taking the pictures for fun and then I'm giving the drone survey to the client for free? No, if you're doing it even if you're not charging for it, if you're doing it associated with any sort of commercial activity, it counts as commercial activity. And you would need your Part 107 and follow all the Part 107 rules. If you're actually, truly, honestly just flying for fun, then you follow Section 336 and you operate under a set of community guidelines and that sort of thing. So it's totally separate, totally different rules. You do not need to know the nuances of 336. You do not need to know any of the community guidelines. But these guys have been operating in the airspace safely since, the 70s and whatnot. And so they have their own special set of rules. All right. And then lastly, on this, the actual text of the law is information about waivers. So what is a waiver? A waiver is basically saying, hey, FAA, I don't like one of those rules. I want to get a waiver from it. I want to be able to operate without following the rules as they are written in Part 107. It's actually part of the law, part of what is written within the text of Part 107 is the process for getting a waiver from other certain parts of Part 107. However, these are individual applications. They're typically for individual pilots or individual companies, and only certain rules can get a waiver. Operating from a moving vehicle or aircraft, except for delivery, can get a waiver. Daylight operation, if you want to fly at night, you can get a waiver for that. Those are actually very popular. Visual line of sight operation, except for delivery. Lots of people have tried that. They've basically never been granted with some weird exceptions. But flying with or without visual observers, operation of multiple UAS, yielding right of way, operations over people, flying in ABCD airspace, and speed, visibility, and altitude. These you can get waivers for them from the FAA. If you've ever seen any sort of commercial aircraft performance that does not follow all of the rules that I just laid out, odds are they got a waiver. Waivers are very, very time-consuming and expensive to get, and are not by any means guaranteed. Daylight operation waivers are becoming a lot more common. Things like visual line of sight operational waivers, almost totally unheard of. Operation of multiple UAS, you may have seen like Intel fly their swarm of 150 drones or various performances. They have a very, very specialized waiver, and they gave many lawyers a lot of money to be able to get that waiver. So they exist. That is how how big companies are able to do weird things like that. Real world, they're extremely expensive and take months and months and months, and you typically need a specialized lawyer to even get one written up properly. But they will be tested on, because you can, strictly speaking, you can get a waiver. And when I say that one of the key lines here is with information and operations proving they can be completed safely. And that is left to the judgment of the administrator. The administrator is what the FAA often refers to itself as, like the administrator of the FAA. So they've used that kind of broad sweeping judgment that they can approve or deny any waiver if they determine that they're the only people that have the judgment to do so, and if they say it's not safe and if your ops aren't good enough, then your waiver gets rejected, and that's where most waivers end up, is in a trash heap. So that's part of the waiver process. Questions there? Questions about waivers?
So you said the daylight operation is the most popular, the waiver,
Yeah, it's the most common one.
and is that equally difficult, like for the big companies?
It's a little easier because people have figured it out, and so there are templates that you can download online. I think they've granted at least a couple of hundred of those that are waivers from daylight operation. So if you want to fly commercially at night, quite frankly for surveying, it's not of much use because you need light to be able to see stuff. So it's mostly going to be for specialized cinematography, real estate photographers that want to take cool fancy photos at night with the house under lights or something like that. But yeah, those are actually becoming more and more easy to get. But the other ones, like I said, visual line of sight, operating over people, those ones are super, super hard to get.
So if you get a waiver for, say, daylight so that you can operate at night, is that waiver typically for only a specific project you are doing, or do people obtain a waiver that this pilot can fly when he wants at night?
Every waiver is custom. Every single waiver is custom. It can be for a single mission, where it's for a single date, for a single project, and you have all of these special operational things that you put in place. It can be for one drone at night, as long as you follow other things. But every single waiver is bespoke, every waiver is custom. And that's part of why you can put in all these specific exemptions too. Again, I'll go to Intel because they have some of the most unique waivers out there. Like, I want to fly 500 drones with one pilot in command over the Super Bowl. They did it. But it was a very custom waiver. It was very date constrained. It was very restricted in what it can do. And it was only for that one-time thing. They probably spent $1 million on paperwork for that one flight. But yeah, every waiver is totally bespoke. That's part of why it's such a pain in the ass process, and every waiver is individually reviewed.
Consequences for, let's say, flying over people and getting caught.
Yeah, let's see. I don't think I have it in there. The FAA can revoke your pilot certificate, and they can fine you as well. I believe the fines are something like, this number's not going to be on the test, but it's something on the order of $10,000 maximum fine per occurrence, I want to say. I should look that up. If you drop me your card, I can look that up and get the answer to you. But yeah, they can take your license and they can fine you. They can't send you to jail though. Real world, they don't do that very often. I think in the last 3 years there have been no more than a handful of enforcement actions, and those are only against some of the most egregious violations, like you're flying within, a couple hundred feet of a major airport and actively interfering with air traffic, or you're flying over a huge major, concert venue with 100,000 people and you're not following any safety protocols. Oh, and you crashed and hit someone. Yeah, then they might go after you. But the FAA enforcement actions are rare, few and far between.
All these things, you mentioned that you don't have to have a license for recreational purposes, but are all these rules in the, I only ask because, they fly at night and whatever, they're for recreation, do they follow these same rules?
No, totally different set of rules. Absolutely.
Are they similar?
Kind of. Yeah, there are some similarities. They have different rules for flying in restricted airspace. They don't actually have the same operational standards. They fly much, much higher. They have some other rules that are stricter when it says operating within a set of community guidelines. There's something called the Academy of Model Aeronautics, which is a popular community group that does all this. They have their own set of rules that are very, very strict safety rules about radio communications, understanding the airspace around you, and they can fly up to 10,000 feet or so legally sometimes, but then other parts of operating within those community guidelines are a lot stricter. It's honestly just a different ballgame. It's a totally different ballgame. And a lot of people break those rules too, if I'm being honest. They don't follow the rules and the community guidelines of the AMA and whatnot. But yeah, it's different. It's very different.
Yeah.
So a lot
like flying over people and
do that.
Visual line of sight, and that sort of business, they can do that, right?
Yep.
Gotcha.
So in some cases, it's a lot more open. To be honest, the FAA hates it. They want to get rid of it. They hate that Section 333 exists. They've been trying to kill it for the last 5 years, but they can't. They haven't been successful in doing so because they don't think it's safe. They don't like it. They want everyone to follow these exact rules. All right. So that's the text of Part 107. I'm going to dive right into the next module too in a couple of minutes. But just kind of wrapping it up, one of the many documents that I can give you guys at the end of this is just a 2-page summary of like the bullet points about what are on here, or what is on Part 107. But that is the text of the law. Those are kind of the things that are written in the rule. Everything else that we're covering today is all of the other good, fun stuff that's going to be on the test and not the text of the law. So that's just the text of the law. Any questions before I kind of move on? Sure.
Yeah, it's kind of a strange question. What if you are licensed but you're flying for recreational reasons?
Totally allowed. Yep. And
Under recreational flight.
And yeah, you can fly recreationally under recreational laws even if you are licensed, so long as it is truly a recreational mission. Yep, I fly recreationally all the time. There's a flying field kind of out by our office that it's within airport controlled airspace, but we don't have to, file for a waiver or get an airspace authorization or anything because we're flying under recreational rules. And we do follow all the recreational rules there. So yeah, just because you have a license doesn't mean that you are no longer allowed to fly recreationally.
Do you fly the same work drones, or do you have like a special
Sometimes.
zipping around plane?
That's the benefit of being the founder. I can kind of take it out of the warehouse with no one looking.
So I got one question.
Sure.
I mean, if you were, suppose you wanted to make some sort of a advertising video for your company website, but you weren't flying to deliver anything in client,
Still commercial purposes.
still commercial?
Still commercial purposes. Yep.
Can't get above 400 feet to,
Yep. Still commercial.
but I could go on vacation, do that, and if I put it on my website, I violated the rules.
Yep. It's actually one of those kind of weird catch-22s of the law. You can fly recreationally and take photos recreationally, and the flight is legal. If you sell those photos after the fact, then the flight becomes illegal kind of ex post facto because you sold the photos. Super weird how that happens, but strictly speaking, like a recreational flight and then you sell the photos or post them on a commercial website, that makes the flight illegal after the fact. Weird, but it's the way that it's totally true. That's just the way that the law is written. It becomes a commercial flight. All right. So, next up, we are getting into understanding the national airspace, the NAS, and a little bit more about this. So, we're going to go into more with this module, different types of airspace in the United States, which has, generally speaking, 3 categories. Controlled airspace, which is going to be Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and Echo. Controlled meaning that it is controlled by air traffic control. Uncontrolled airspace, class Golf, that means there is no air traffic control. That's where, honestly, most drone flights are going to be operated as in class Golf. And then the catch-all, other special use airspace. Restricted areas, military areas, and a few things like that. We will also talk about airport operations, giving you a familiarity of how airports in the U.S. work so that you can avoid planes when you are flying near them. The basics of aviation radio communications, something that you will almost never, ever, ever, ever have to do, but is on the test. And aviation weather, which sucks. If you're taking your recurrent knowledge test, you don't have to worry about it. But so, here are, I said 3, now I have 4 different types of airspace. Probably should make those slides a bit more consistent. But controlled airspace, as we talked about earlier, Alpha is your very, very high altitude cruising speed for commercial airliners. B, C, and D are all going to be airports. Bravo are your super, super busy ones. I think there are maybe 50 class Bravo airports in the United States. Charlie, medium airports. D, Delta, small airports. And Echo is other controlled airspace. Yeah.
For any reason, there's not an F?
I don't know, honestly. But there isn't. There might have been at one point, honestly. So uncontrolled is class G. We'll get into actually looks like in a second. Special use airspace are prohibited, restricted, warning, MOAs, military operation areas, alert areas, controlled firing areas. We'll go into those a bit more, I think, later. And then other, which are going to be weird stuff, like military training routes, where there might be low-flying, fast-flying jets and helicopters, wildlife areas and national parks, marine areas, test balloons, and parachute jump operations. Just more of the fun, nuanced stuff that they're going to put on the test. So more information about the airspace. We already covered this a little bit, but upside down wedding cake, it is shaped, usually a radius from a certain point. I say usually because everything is going to be bespoke for each airport. And UAS pilots need air traffic control permission for everything except Class G. That's going to be, again, one of those, like, almost guaranteed that that's going to be a question on the test. If it is Class Bravo, do you need permission permission? Yes, from air traffic control. Now, what air traffic control permission means kind of has been changing a little bit over time. You can get permission directly from the FAA. You can get permission from the control tower as well. But for a text of the test, the answer is you need permission from air traffic control for everything except Class G, Class Bravo. So, reviewing this again a little bit. Class A is high altitude, 18,000 feet and up. Again, important, not 17,999, that's going to be Class E. Not relevant to remote pilots and not allowed for remote pilots. Class Bravo, nation's busiest airports. Generally, the surface up to 10,000 feet. That's a good one to remember because we'll see it on some of the charts. And also, generally, Class Bravo is in mean sea level. Class Charlie is your medium airports, usually surface to 4,000 feet above the airport in a 5 nautical mile radius. That means if I look kind of right here, surface to 4,000 feet for this 5 mile radius, and then for that kind of upper level, it's going to be usually 12,000 feet above the airport to 4,000 feet above the airport for a 10 nautical mile radius. Notice what I'm doing here. Some of those, Class B, generally measured in mean sea level, 10,000 feet. Class Charlie, generally measured above the airport or above ground level. Same thing, Class Delta, generally surface to 2,500 feet above ground level. These are going to be noted on the charts that we look for, but the difference between some being mean sea level, some being above ground is going to matter. And then Class E is usually all airspace above 700 feet, or in some cases above 1,200 feet AGL, up to, that's kind of a typo, up to 17,999 mean sea level, but sometimes down to the ground on small airports or approach paths. I've got a trick that I'll be showing you guys soon of how to actually remember all of this stuff during the test, because there's an exhibit on the test booklet that you get that actually kind of gives you a lot more of this information so that you don't have to remember absolutely everything. So we talked about uncontrolled airspace, Class G, all airspace that is, from a definition standpoint, all airspace that is not A, B, C, D, or E is Class G. It is usually the surface to the base of Class E. This is what almost, like this kind of section right here, the surface up to 700 feet is typically what actually most of the kind of ground of the United States is. And the rest are smaller areas. And no air traffic control permission required. You do not need pre-approval from anyone. You can just go out and fly. Now that doesn't mean that all of the stuff I talked about in the last module still applies. You still need to see and avoid aircraft. You still need to maintain separation. You still need to keep it within visual line of sight, but you just don't need air traffic control permission. Within those Class Bravo, Charlie, and Delta, and Echo airports, all the same rules apply. You just need air traffic control permission. You still need to see and avoid. You still need to keep it visual line of sight. Still maximum 400 feet, unless you're within 400 feet of a building, etc. So let's talk about special use airspace now. What I'm showing you on the right, these are going to be some of your VFR charts. The next module is when we start diving into exactly what all of the different nuances of VFR charts. But right now we're just going to talk about what some of these different types of airspace are. So prohibited, restricted, and warning. Prohibited are listed on charts with a letter P, like you see in the top right. There's that P-40, that's going to be a prohibited area. That means flying is just prohibited altogether. The White House, for example, is a prohibited flying area. Under no circumstances are you allowed to fly over the White House. Restricted areas are going to be restricted, and you need authorization from the controlling entity. Kind of the same as flying in controlled airspace, but each one's going to be different and for different reasons. Restricted are going to be sometimes military airspace. I think like Area 51 over Nevada is technically speaking a restricted airspace, but good luck getting permission. Probably not going to get it. And then there are things called warning areas, which have a W, like international waters where you must take caution, but flying is allowed. This is all, to be honest, more stuff that you need to know for the test, and you can forget it afterwards because there are online tools that make reading these charts so much easier than what we have to do for the test. But these are prohibited, restricted, and warning are some of the basic special use airspace. There are also a few other ones called MOAs, Military Operations Area. You see up there, Brush Creek MOA. You want to be very careful of low-flying military aircraft so that it's allowed. Alert areas, also shown there, depicted on charts with an A. High volume of things like pilot training, be careful, but flying is allowed. That's quite honestly, a lot of this stuff is be careful, but flying is allowed. Even things like controlled firing areas. This is one of the weirder ones. They're areas where the military is going to be doing artillery testing perhaps, and you're allowed to fly, and what is supposed to happen is that if they're doing firing tests and they see an aircraft, even a drone, then they're supposed to suspend all of their testing and firing until you fly away. Unlikely that you'll ever come across a controlled firing area with a drone unless you're doing something really shady. But that's how it works. These are your special use airspaces that you're gonna see on your chart. And now there are other airspace. Military training routes are an interesting one. So you see that little line on there that says IR-037. That's going to be a depicted standard military training route. There's a good chance that there will be a question about a military training route somewhere on your test or something like that. They are just those thin lines that are listed on charts with an IR number or a VR number. Those are going to be military training routes. Other stuff just to talk about with other airspace. Wildlife, wilderness, and national parks are often marked on charts as well and are going to be prohibited for drone flying. You cannot fly a drone in a national park. Actually, I should correct myself. This matters too. You cannot take off or land a drone in a national park, but you can fly over it, and you need to be aware of it. Generally, for small aircraft with the visual line of sight things, that winds up being the same thing. If you can't take off in it, then you can't fly in it. But from a strict legal standpoint, national parks, you may not take off or land, but you can fly in their airspace. Weird rules and restrictions, that's just the way the law's written. Same thing, no marine areas, so off the coasts you might see that. Tethered balloons for weather balloons or any other sort of manned balloon will be marked on there. And parachute jump aircraft operations will also be marked on these charts. I'll show you those symbols in a second.
Do you ever have a special situation come up with any of these areas?
In the real world, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, almost never. Most of these areas are going to be very remote that would have such a tiny, small level of commercial activity that there's not much of a reason to fly in many of these places. Like I said, so military bases are where a lot of this stuff is going to happen. So unless you are actively doing surveying on a military base for the military, you're very unlikely to ever accidentally stumble into one of these places. It's not like there's going to be a military training route flying over St. George. It's just not going to happen.
Like if the President of the United States flies in.
That's a different one. That's called a TFR. We'll cover TFRs in a second too. Hey, what do you know? Next slide. TFRs, temporary flight restrictions. These are temporary areas where you cannot fly, and these do come up. So TFRs are another guarantee that there will be a question on the test about temporary flight restrictions, partly because these are really important. This is also one of those things that I'll put my real world hat on and say, even in the real world, this is one of the more important rules to follow, because the FAA will kill you if you violate one of these. They are temporary things where you cannot fly. They are established by what's called a NOTAM, or a Notice to Airmen, and they should be checked regularly as part of flight planning. There are certain sites that do it, like AirMap. TFR.FAA.gov has them in a very non-user-friendly format. Many, if not most, drone mission planning apps now have these baked in as well because they're actually important. Things like wildfires. That's a big one. I'm from California. Flying in a wildfire area and interfering with aircraft that are fighting fires is a huge no-no. Air shows, another thing. Air shows are going to have aircraft flying, down to a couple feet above the ground or something. Don't fly a drone. VIP presidential flights or large sporting events like the Super Bowl or even MLB and NFL games have flight restrictions placed on them. I think an hour before and an hour after kickoff or something or an hour after the game's over. So TFRs are pretty serious. Temporary flight restrictions, they are temporary. They are issued by what is called a Notice to Airmen, and then they are going to be published on a billion different sources after that. They are temporary in nature, so they are not going to be on your VFR charts, and it is your responsibility as the pilot in command to check for TFRs and be aware of TFRs in the area that you are flying. Question about TFRs? I want to make sure you know this one, because TFRs are really pretty important.
Is there a good app or website that you can?
I like AirMap. AirMap is a very useful chart of all the different types of airspace, as well as it'll have all the live TFRs as they come up too. All right, so that's TFRs. Let's go into airport operations. There are two main types of airports: towered and non-towered airports. A towered airport is, as you can see, it has a tower, and generally that person will have that tower will have a person in it that is operating a radio to discuss and manage air traffic for that airport. Air traffic control is responsible for these operations. A non-towered airport has no operating control tower. It may have a physical tower, but with no one in it. Two-way radio communication is not required, but is pretty much universal there. And it's good practice to monitor radio communications on the CTAF, or Common Traffic Advisory Frequency. These are going to be, honestly, the vast majority of airports in the United States by number are going to be non-towered airports. Little rural airports all over the place. There are tens of thousands of small, tiny, non-towered airports in the United States. Some of them are nothing more than a dirt strip, but they count as a non-towered airport. And they have their own set of radio communications, and according to Part 107, it's a good idea to monitor radio communications on the CTAF, which is going to be the radio frequency that airport communicates on. Real world, no, you're not going to have an aviation radio in the field, but according to the test, yes, it's good practice to monitor radio communications. Airports can be further subdivided into civil airports, most public airports like that, military and government airports, which are drone use or something, military use, and private airports, which someone owns. Again, private airports, you probably don't experience them much in life because you wouldn't fly in or out of them much unless you own a plane, but by number, they're the most common airports in the US. And if you look at a lot of these charts, there are private airports everywhere in rural areas, all over the place that you never know are there, because they might only get 1 or 2 flights a year even, or sometimes less.
If you have a mix of the two, which one's going to govern? If I had a military and a private, more than likely the military would govern, but like Airport 2 in Salt Lake, it's a military airport that has Apaches and stuff like that. It's a helicopter.
So the fact is that'll probably be a civil airport because the military can use civil airports, and it's not covered on the test, but they can actually change designations too. So it can be a military airport within this time period, and then non-military airport otherwise. Same thing with towered and non-towered. An airport might switch from a towered to a non-towered airport based on time of day. All right, so where can airport operations information come from? Airport data can come from aeronautical charts. That's going to be the big one that we're covering in the next section. the Chart Supplement US, formerly known as the Airport Facility Directory, Notices to Airmen, NOTAMs, and ATIS, the Automated Terminal Information Service. These are buzzwords, oh, sorry.
Just gonna ask, are all these acronyms on the test?
Yep, sure are. This is actually a great, these 4 things are worth knowing because there's probably a question on the test like, hey, if you need information about airport information, where can you get it from? The answer is the Chart Supplement US. That is a source of airport operation information where you can find what the radio frequency is. Just an example question that might be tricky, like where can you find the radio frequency for airport, KSSNA or whatever? The answer is in the Chart Supplement US or in your aeronautical charts, something like that. So yeah, this sort of thing will potentially be on the test. It's this sort of kind of detailed stuff, which is why what we usually recommend is go through all this stuff again like the day before you take your test so that it's fresh in your mind.
Does a private helicopter pad count as an airport? Would that be on a chart?
Yes, helicopter pads are often on charts, but they don't actually have major impacts for Part 107 because what you really care about is controlled airspace. If the helicopter pad is in Class Delta airspace, then you really need to worry about it because it's in controlled airspace. If there's a helicopter pad that's in Class Gulf airspace, then maybe you need to be aware of it if it's marked on the chart, and just see and avoid when it's there. To be clear, like a lot of this stuff, when we talk about see and avoid, it's not like stay away from airports at all costs. You can fly legally within 50 feet of a helicopter or another aircraft if you see and avoid the other aircraft and if you do it safely and in uncontrolled airspace. That probably 50 feet of a helicopter would probably be a stupid idea because the prop wash is going to just wreck it around. But it's not the rules don't say you must stay 100 miles away from all aircraft and all airports or something. They say if you're within controlled airspace, air traffic control permission, and if you're not in controlled airspace, all see and avoid things are still required. All right, traffic patterns. Airport traffic patterns that you need to be aware of because if you are flying near a small airport, whether it's an uncontrolled airport and maybe someone's coming in for a landing, like a small general aviation aircraft, or if you have got air traffic control permission to fly near a big aircraft and want to have a general ability to predict and understand where the aircraft are going. A typical airplane or airport runway will follow a rectangular pattern like this. Typical pattern altitude is 1,000 feet above the airport runway altitude. The way that it works, this is what's called a left-hand traffic pattern, is what you see up here, because the turns that the aircraft are making are left-hand. So it comes in from that kind of top corner onto what is called the downwind leg, makes a left-hand turn onto a base, and then finally another left-hand turn onto its final approach for landing. There can be both left-hand and right-hand airports, but just being able to know, hey, I'm looking at it, the aircraft's going to come down, it flies the opposite, parallel to the runway, opposite direction of the way it's going to land. That is what a standard airport traffic pattern looks like. And this is how all pilots are going to fly for those kind of non-towered airports for general aviation, that sort of thing. Your major Class Bravo airports are going to be a little different. This is what it looks like for smaller airports, rural airports, anything where you have general aviation aircraft flying is, they're going to have that, they're entering on that downwind pattern, they're going to go parallel to the runway in the opposite direction downwind, and they're going to make either 2 lefts or 2 right-hand turns into their base and final before landing. Like I said, can either be a left-hand pattern or a right-hand pattern. This is reversed. And also they can actually change left and right-hand patterns based on the prevailing winds. All right, next up when understanding the airspace, longitude and latitude. You need to have a basic understanding of longitude and latitude for the test. Latitude lines are going to be the horizontal ones that measure north to south. So that is going to be from 0 to 90 degrees latitude. What I like to do for reference, what honestly helps me on these tests, because I sometimes just forget this stuff, 48 contiguous states are between 25 and 49 degrees latitude, and the US is between 67 and 125 west longitude. So yeah, longitude lines are then horizontal and measure east to west. You will have to know some of this stuff and like use latitude and longitude on a chart they'll give you on the exam probably to measure, you know, what airport is at 85 west longitude, and then find it on the chart. So having a basic familiarity of longitude and latitude is going to be a necessary thing to know. Another important thing to know is the difference between magnetic north and true north. There is a variation between true north, which would go directly to the North Pole, and magnetic north, which goes to the magnetic North Pole, which actually drifts around quite a bit. That's because the Earth is not uniformly magnetized, so there is an amount of magnetic variation that's going to show up on your aeronautical charts as broken magenta lines that connect points of equal variation. So that means it'll either say, you know, +1, +2 degrees, -1, -2 degrees. You probably won't have to calculate that on the test or anything, but you might have to know that that exists and know that your compass, your magnetic compass, is not always going to point to true north. All right, let's talk a bit more about radio communications on airports. That is how aircraft communicate to each other. That is how manned aircraft avoid each other and don't crash into each other. That's how they announce themselves at different airports. Small UAV pilots are not expected to communicate over radio frequencies, but they should be able to understand the basics of aviation language. Why, do you ask? Because the FAA said so. Stop asking questions. You may want to use the radio for alertness when operating near airports. Real world, no, you would not want to. FAA, yes, you may want to use the radio for alertness. Not required to communicate with manned aircraft, but should be familiar with their traffic patterns and understand basic radio procedures and phraseology. So here's some kind of basic procedures. When a manned aircraft is approaching a non-towered airport, they typically send an initial radio broadcast when they're 10 miles out. And it'll sound something like this. Town and country traffic, that's the airport town and country, and you're talking to its traffic frequency. This is Cessna 123 Bravo Foxtrot, which is going to be its tail number, its identification number, is 10 miles south inbound for landing, town and country traffic. That's a full radio communication, pretty brief, basically an aircraft saying, hey, who are you talking to, what aircraft are you, and what are you doing? 10 miles south inbound for landing. Remote pilots must always look for other aircraft in the area and use a radio for an extra layer of situational awareness. According to Part 107, whether or not you're using radio, see and avoid is what matters, not listen and avoid. See and avoid is what matters, but having that basic familiarity of radio is considered to be a good extra layer. All right, let's start getting into some aviation weather. Let's check our time. We got another 20 minutes here before moving on. There are numerous different aspects of weather that impact aircraft performance. Duh. Those include things like density altitude, which is going to be what we were talking about with the air density of the air. The higher you get, a high density altitude means that it is low air pressure and your aircraft is going to have trouble flying. Density altitude is mostly impacted by the actual elevation that you're at, but can be impacted by other things such as humidity and weather and temperature. Wind and turbulence, wind shear, atmospheric stability, temperature, dew point, cloud types, and thunderstorms. Let's start just diving in and going into this. Low aircraft performance. In general, weather can negatively impact aircraft performance by rate of climb. Oh, I should also put another context here. When I'm talking about this, most of this stuff, because of the FAA's mindset, is going to be about fixed-wing aircraft performance, not multi-rotor aircraft performance. So for rate of climb, for example, like a drone goes straight up, your fixed-wings aircraft are going to be flying, slowly at an upward angle. Fixed-wing are much, much, much more susceptible to weather than multi-rotors are. They're generally going to be more resilient than others. But things like your rate of climb will be impacted. Bad weather, thin air, you climb slower. Aircraft ceiling, maximum altitude, that's what we were talking about earlier. overall range, speed, stability, fuel, and battery life too. So you can either go faster or slower depending on the aircraft. Turbulence makes it unstable, and typically any changes in weather or any adverse weather is almost always going to do nothing but hurt your fuel life or your fuel range or battery life. So starting with density altitude, this actually refers to how thick the atmosphere is. And it's changed primarily by altitude, that's the biggest one, but also temperature and humidity are smaller ones. So aircraft fly well in thick, dense air. And thick, dense air happens when you are at low altitudes, low temperatures. Colder weather actually makes the air thicker, so better performance in that way. Low humidity, because of the way the water vapor works, it makes the air thinner. And high atmospheric pressure, so big high atmospheric pressure front is going to actually make your aircraft fly better. Aircraft fly poorly with high altitude, high temperatures, high humidity, and low atmospheric pressure. All of that together with high altitude is called a high density altitude. And then low density altitude is going to be when you have low altitudes, low temperatures, low humidity, that sort of thing. Next up is wind and turbulence. You should be aware that obstructions like hills, mountains, and buildings can cause turbulence. Buildings are most applicable for small UAVs. Wind moving over an object can create turbulence and downward pressure, negatively impacting aircraft performance. It typically happens most in the leeward side of a mountain, so the wind is fairly smooth going over an obstruction, and then once it crests over it, on the opposite side, there's going to be all sorts of crazy, nasty turbulence. Same with buildings. The wind coming into the building is typically going to be smooth-ish, and then on the other side of an obstacle, there's going to be all kinds of turbulence, and unsurprisingly, turbulence negatively impacts aircraft performance. Wind shear and stability, let's talk about that. Wind shear is rapidly changing wind conditions, which is commonly associated with passing storm systems. That's really all you have to know for the test is what wind shear is. Storm systems can make the wind rapidly change as you're flying 15 miles an hour north to 15 miles an hour south somewhere else. Very, very dangerous for manned aircraft, not super impactful on most UAV operations. Structural icing, now that's a little bit more impactful for us. Structural icing can happen when the aircraft is flying through visible water, rain or clouds or fog, and the temperature where the moisture strikes the aircraft is 0 degrees Celsius or colder. Now, to be very, very clear, this does not mean that the ambient temperature is 0 degrees or colder. It means the temperature where the air is striking the aircraft wing. Because there are all kinds of crazy aerodynamics, this can happen even when the ambient temperature is above 0 degrees Celsius. The ambient temperature is above freezing. Structural icing is still possible, and we need to be aware of that. It is extremely dangerous if ice forms on a wing or propeller. It can totally seize up, lose all of its lift, and just come crashing down. All right, atmospheric stability. This is another just weird one that, for whatever reason, the FAA likes putting this sort of thing on the test. Atmospheric stability and inversions. An inversion happens when hot air rises above cool air. And that creates this inversion, which leads to significant atmospheric instability and will cause significant turbulence. As a small UAV pilot, you will never experience this while flying because you won't be flying in these sorts of situations or altitudes or anything that will actually impact this, but the FAA loves testing on it. So inversions are when hot air rises above cold air. So we see that on the right, that's going to be your inversion, and that is associated with considerable atmospheric instability. They often occur on clear, cool nights when the air close to the ground is cooled by the lower temperature of the ground, and the warm air above it has stayed above it. That causes your temperature inversion, that causes atmospheric stability. Know this slide, know the word inversion. Inversion is an important word that is often on the test. Next up, as we talk more about atmospheric stability. Stability of an air mass determines its typical weather characteristics, and there are some counterintuitive things here. Unstable air is typically classified by big puffy cumuliform clouds, showery precipitation, rough air, and the most unusual thing, good visibility. Good visibility is often a sign of an unstable air mass, whereas stable air is often characterized by stratiform clouds like those ones on the right, Continuous smooth precipitation, smooth air, and fair to poor visibility in like haze and smoke. Haze and smoke is really kind of weirdly associated with good stable air masses. Good visibility is a sign of unstable air masses. Next up is temperature and dew point. Dew point is the temperature at which fog, dew, mist, clouds, rain, or snow will form at current humidity levels. Dew presents little risk to small UAVs, however, frost and moisture accumulation on the flight surfaces, propellers, wings, etc. can be dangerous, and dew can form on wings even if the ambient temperature is above the dew point. Dew point also changes with altitude, or can change with altitude, as we see up here. If the dew point is the same at 65, as you rise in altitude, it gets colder, and that's where clouds will actually form at the dew point. As you know from earlier on, you are not allowed to fly a drone through a cloud. Even if you could, that is where dew forms or icing can form, but that would be in violation of Part 107 anyway. And then next up is thunderstorms. So this is what a thunderstorm life cycle actually looks like. More stuff. I hate how often I have to apologize for the stuff that they actually put on the test. The thunderstorm life cycle is something that is potentially tested. It has three main stages: the cumulus stage, which is a big updraft where clouds start forming; a mature stage, which can go 5 to 10 miles in height. Why they test on this when your flight ceiling is 400 feet and they make you know weather up to 40,000 feet? Who knows? But mature stage, this is where precipitation and rain is beginning. It is characterized by extremely fast updrafts and downdrafts and can cause significant surface wind. And then the dissipating stage, where it is mostly downdrafts and only harmless cloud remnants are left. So those are your three basic stages of thunderstorms. So with that, we're about 10 minutes before our next break, which is a good time for a break, because you're probably tired of hearing me talk for that much, and I know that weather stuff can be pretty awful. When we get back, we're going to be talking a heck of a lot more about reading those VFR charts, reading airspace, things like that, and we'll go from there. So we can break. I think we're coming back here. It's 9:50 right now, and we'll be back at about 10:30. So see you in half an hour.